Where does Esau find his wives? Where do his wives come from? They come from Canaan. They are Canaanite women, and he chooses 2 wives who are listed. And how does Rebekah feel about the wives? I don't know if she's being melodramatic or what, but if Isaac marries a wife like this, I'm just going to die. Just shoot me now, because my life is over. What good is my life to me if he marries one of these women? And by the way, how's Esau's attitude along about here? He is bearing a major grudge. And he's basically planning on killing his brother. As soon as his father's dead and buried, then Jacob's dead. So it's hard to tell. I mean, the daughters really did upset Rebekah. There's no doubt about that. But her comment here is probably motivated in part by the fact that she's afraid Esau's going to kill Jacob, and this is a good reason to get him out of town. And so what is her request? Basically, I mean, what she asked him to do? What has she already told her son to do? Go to Haran and go to my brother's house and stay with him a few days until your brother's fury subsides. This was not a 30-minute trip. I mean, this was a many days trip, and that few days is a little bit short. Isaac calls Jacob then in chapter 28 and gives him another blessing, and probably for the trip, and gives him a charge. And what's his charge? Do not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. What had Abraham's charge been to his servant when he sent his servant? Do not let him marry somebody here. If I'm going to find a wife from there, and you don't take him back there either. Bring her back here. And so he did not want him marrying anybody local, his son marrying anybody local, and did not want him heading back and backtracking the way they had already come. It'd be defeating the purpose. But here, I guess it's not. And so the instruction is to go to Laban, Rebekah's brother's house. And in verse 3, what is the blessing that Isaac gives to Jacob? May he make you fruitful and multiply you, become a company of peoples, and then also give you the blessing of Abraham and to your descendants so that you can possess this land that was given to Abraham. And so it's clear all along that the intention is for him to return home and not to stay there. Verse 6. Heard this transaction that Isaac was not to take a wife from the daughters of Canaan, and that it pleased his father and mother for Jacob to go marry a relative. In verse 8 it said, he saw that the daughters of Canaan displeased his father Isaac, that he went to Ishmael and married, besides the other wives he had, this daughter of Ishmael. The common thought is that he was doing this to try to please his parents, that he saw that Jacob was doing something that pleased his parents, and so he wanted to please his parents too. I'm not 100% sure about that. I'm not sure about what he does it to spite them anyway, because Ishmael is the son of an Egyptian and his wife is Egyptian. He's relative, but I don't think there's much good blood between Ishmael and Isaac. If you look at their track record, I don't know that the family of Isaac is all that close to the family of Ishmael. So I don't know whether he did this to please his parents or did it to displease his parents anymore.
What was the nationality? I mean, yes, Egyptian
Well, Ishmael was a descendant of Abraham, obviously, but he was half Egyptian, and then it says that his mother took a wife for him from Egypt.
So they would have been Egyptian, not Canaanite.
Yeah, they weren't Canaanite for sure, but it's hard to tell what motivated him here. There's another account in chapter 36 of his wives, and they don't mesh superficially. There are good explanations of how to put these two together, but in chapter 36 it gives more of his lineage, generations of Esau. And if you compare that to the earlier one, they don't superficially meet. Back in chapter 26, in verses 34 and verse 34. But there are different possibilities that he had 4 wives instead of 3. If you go back to chapter 26, verse 34, it has him marrying Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. But in chapter 36, it has Ishmael's daughter named Basemath, which is not the same as in chapter 27, the name of the daughter. And so they don't match superficially, but we know they do harmonize. We just don't know exactly how they do, whether one woman had multiple names or whether he had 4 wives, or what the explanation is. We do know something about his character. In Hebrews chapter 12, beginning in verse 15, we know that he despised his birthright, is how it's described when he sold his birthright for a bowl of stew. In Hebrews 12 from verse 15, verse 14 says, "Pursue after peace with all men, and after the sanctification without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by it may be defiled, that there be no immoral or godless person like Esau, who sold his own birthright for a single meal. For you know that even afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, though he sought for it with tears." But the Hebrew writer describes him as being immoral and godless. And so that's the description that's used for Esau by the Hebrew writer. Jacob does head on to the home of his uncle. And then something interesting happens along the way. What happens as Jacob is traveling, headed toward his uncle's house? He has a dream. He stops for the night, and based on the distance, the location is probably like maybe the third day of his journey. And what does he see in the dream? He sees a ladder, and what's the situation with the ladder? Okay, so the base was set on the earth, and the top of it was reaching up into heaven.
I always thought of it as an escalator when I was a little kid.
Of an escalator?
Yeah, I always had that.
Some of your translations have a stairway, and this is the only place this word ladder is used, and the word does have the connotation of a stair. A lot of the early civilizations had stepped pyramids, the ziggurats. The Babylonians had ziggurats, and they were, instead of being smooth-sided pyramids, they were made by right angles. But the idea was that they ascended up into heaven. The stairway was up to heaven, so it was not an uncommon picture to think of a stairway to heaven. And so that, an escalator may not be a terrible.
I just had that in my head. They just moved magically.
And we see a ladder with rungs on it, and that's probably not what it was. It was probably more of a staircase, and the angels descending and ascending. And who's at the top of the stairway? God is. And what does God say? I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and your descendants. So there's the land promise. And then in verse 14, he says that the descendants will be how numerous? Like the dust of the earth. And then the greatest of the blessings, in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So here's that threefold promise again. Also in verse 15, what else does God promise as a personal promise? I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and bring you back to this land. And I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you, which does not mean he's going to leave him once he has done what he's promised. He's just saying that, don't worry, I'm not going to leave you. And when Jacob woke up, what was his response? Surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't even know it. And he said, how awesome is this place? This must be the house of God, the gate of heaven. He'd used a stone as a headrest, and then he took that stone in the morning and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on it. And what did he name that location? Bethel. Beth is the Hebrew word for house. El means God, and so Bethel means house of God. See, you know Hebrew. And so Jason's not so sure. They know some Hebrew. Now, Jacob needs a life-changing event. Why does Jacob need a life-changing event? How has Jacob gotten to the point where he is before that night? Deception, lying, conniving, manipulating. Everything that's gotten him to where he is that night has not been good. That is not how it's going to go on. He needs to have a meeting with God. And this is going to be a life-changing event. He needs to have some FaceTime with God. And so, God changes the dynamics here. Here's God, here's the stairway, here are the angels, and he needs to be impressed with not his own ability to cheat and lie, but the ability of God. Because in spite of, he hasn't gotten where he has because of what he's done. He has gotten where he has in spite of what he has done. Because God has taken him where he is in spite of his interference. And so he really needs to have this meeting time with God to reevaluate. And so he makes a deal with God. I guess you could call it a vow, but it sounds almost like a bargain to me. Maybe that's what vows are. It says it's a vow. What's his vow? What's his bargain?
Provides for him, and he'll be his God, and he'll give him a
Yeah, if he will take care of me and take me back home safely, then he will be my God.
It does kind of make you feel, though, that Jacob, he was under his dad's protection. He had everything. It makes you feel like, he's worried about enough to eat and having clothes to wear when you get home. It makes you think that he felt vulnerable, that he was insecure.
Yeah, and that's a good point, that he had to be off by himself alone to really come to the realization of his need. Now, we pointed out, how rich was Abraham? He was filthy rich. And so how rich was Isaac? All of that plus a whole bunch more. Isaac was richer than Abraham. He was really, 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 really rich. And that's how Jacob had grown up. And he had manipulated to get a double portion of the inheritance and the blessing, which did him absolutely no good when he had to leave.
I think it's crazy to think that it
Yeah, and that's,
how God establishes this covenant with Jacob. Wait, his name, yeah, Jacob.
yeah,
And, it's like, okay, it's you. We're going through you. He still doesn't have control of all that stuff, and so.
yeah. And I think he realizes here that he's without any of that stuff, and his only hope is whatever God's going to do for him. He's not going to be able to manipulate and cheat and lie his way, and what he inherits from his father is not going to do it. And so he's asking for fundamental things: food, garments, and the ability to return back home. If he takes me back home, then he will be my God. Of course, that God is already his God, but he's just acknowledging that fact in this deal. And he does make a commitment to give a tenth of everything that God has given him. He goes on his journey to the city of Haran, and there was a field. Out in the field there was a well, and it was a big well, but there were 3 flocks of sheep there just beside the well. And it explains what happened. When all the flocks were gathered, they would remove the stone and water the sheep, and then they'd put it back. The different reasons why that might have been necessary. It may have had something to do with evaporation, but it probably had something to do with control. Remember, we've been reading about wells and taking control of wells, and they probably want to make sure that everybody gets only what they're supposed to get and control the well. But they would take the water out of the well, put it in a trough, and the animals would drink, and then they would put the cover back on the well. He comes up, and what question does he ask? Are you from Haran? And they say, yes. He says where you're from, and they say, we're from Haran. And so, number one is he's looking for the right town. And he says, where are you from? And they say, we're from Haran. So that's number one. What's his second thing he's looking for? Laban. He's looking for the right family in the right city. And so his second question is, do you know Laban, the son of Nahor, who was actually the grandson of Nahor, but this uses it, how they often talk about a descendant as a son. And they know him. And he says, okay, how's he doing? Is it well with him? And they said, it's well, and besides, his daughter is coming with the sheep. In verse 7, he may be just a little bit critical, because what are the shepherds doing? They're wasting the better part of the day. It's not time to water the sheep, and they're just sitting around with these flocks of sheep. And he says, go ahead and get your sheep watered and get back out there. This is not your job. Your job is not to sit at the well. And they said, well, we can't. We have to wait till all the flocks are gathered. Well, when would that be? If it wasn't time to water the flocks yet because the sun was still high, they'd be sitting there all day long, waiting for the other sheep to show up so they could water them. While they were still speaking, then Rachel came up. And when she showed up, then Jacob rolled the stone away from the well and watered Laban's flock. And then he kissed Rachel, and what did he do? He wept. He lifted up his voice and wept. Is he really, really sad? Are these tears of sadness? These are tremendous tears of joy. He's so overwhelmed. Why? Why is he so overwhelmed to the point of tears?
And maybe that he just walked there and found her so easily.
For one thing, it's the answer to what he's been looking for. This is why he came. You can imagine Abraham's servant when he walks up and says, okay, God, this is the way it's going to work. You have this, and this. And that happens exactly like that? Can you imagine his joy that he's sent on a task, and as soon as he gets there, the task is successful? And Jacob is going on a mission for a certain thing, and here it's done exactly the way it should be. That's probably the main reason why he was crying. But also, this is a close blood relative that he has never seen. He has never seen his uncle, never met his uncle's family. He knows nothing about this family. And so there has to be some joy, too, at actually meeting and coming in contact with this relative, the daughter of your uncle. It didn't take her long to run back and tell Laban, and as soon as Laban heard the news, what did he do? Ran out and to meet him and embraced him, took him into his house. And there are probably two reasons for this reaction, too. Number one is he's probably really happy to see the son of his sister. He's never seen his sister's family. She was just young when she left. And he was probably overjoyed at seeing his nephew. There may be another reason at play with Laban, because it mentions back when the servant went there that Laban noticed the stuff. He noticed the gold, and he noticed the silver, and he noticed the stuff. And Laban seems to have a pretty good mind toward riches. And so I think he's genuinely overjoyed at seeing his nephew, but at the same time, I think he is really, really happy that this may be a chance to profit. Jacob works with him for a while, for a month, and Laban says, well, you shouldn't have to work for nothing because we're related. What should your wages be? What was Jacob's request? All I want is Rachel. I just love Rachel so much. Just give me your daughter Rachel, and I will work for 7 years in exchange for Rachel. And Laban probably thought, that's a pretty good deal. I was expecting to have to pay him some money or something, and I can just give him my daughter, and he'll work for me for 7 years. And so Jacob worked for 7 years, and what was Jacob's idea through this 7 years? How did he feel? This is just, it was gone. I mean, it seemed like a few days. And snap his finger, and there they are. So they have the big wedding feast, wedding night, and he wakes up in the morning, and guess what? It was Leah, not Rachel. And Laban's,
Talk about a clueless guy.
he was clueless. And that's a good point here in a second. But I just almost see Laban's wheels rolling in these things because, hey, he worked for 7 years for one daughter. I'll give him another one, and maybe he'll work another 7 years for the other one. But it is important that the manipulator is being manipulated. He was the great manipulator. He was manipulating his brother and manipulating his father, and he was the master manipulator, and all of a sudden, he's becoming manipulated.
All that manipulation earlier on was at the direction of his mother, who was Laban's sister.
Yeah.
So there
That may be where it came from, as Laban's sister came up with all the manipulation and then taught it to her son. Yeah, she was the instigator really behind all of the manipulation.
Kind of makes you wonder what their parents were like, Laban and
Yeah, you wonder what Bethuel was like?
Anyway, love is blind.
Yeah, love is blind, really blind. And so Laban said, no problem, work 7 more years and I'll give you Rachel. And so he did. Laban also gave one of his servants to Leah, and one of them to Rachel. So there were the two wives and then the 2 maids. In verse 30, there's that danger sign again. Remember we saw the danger of the favoritism? Isaac loved Esau more, and Rebekah loved Jacob more, and the consequence of that favoritism that was not a positive thing. And now you see that that Jacob loves Rachel more than Leah.
Well, the thing is, he wasn't expecting Leah.
No, he wasn't. That wasn't part of the deal.
His heart was really
And
set.
and so you might be able to understand it, but still, it's just not a good. It's not a nice thing. And so here again, remember we've mentioned how many times that women are barren and then God intervenes, and we see that throughout this whole event that unfolds here. God sees that Leah is unloved, and so he opened her womb, and she had a son, and what does she name him? Reuben. And what was her explanation for that name? And the name means see a son. Basically, she's saying, look, I gave you a son. And what's her rationale there in verse 32? Now my husband will love me because I've had a son. Isn't that sad? That she names her first son hoping that this is going to cause Jacob to love her. And so she conceives again and has a son, and what does she name him? Simeon, which has to do with the fact that God heard, has to do with hearing. God heard that she was unloved, and so gave her another son and named him Simeon. So the first son is named, here's the son, maybe he'll love me. And the second one's named, well, maybe God heard me now because he's heard that I'm hated. And she conceived and had another son, and what did she name him? Levi, which has to do with attachment. Now maybe my husband's going to be attached to me because I have borne 3 sons. And then she conceived and had a 4th son and named him Judah. This time I will praise the Lord. And then she stopped bearing. But isn't it sad that those things in her life are manipulating the names of their children, that they're related to how she's feeling unloved and hated and ignored and not attached? No, she wasn't totally ignored, but emotionally ignored, maybe.
And then even she didn't have her sister to rely on because, well, we'll get into that later.
Yeah, no, they.
Not only was she not loved by her husband, her sister had a.
Yeah, she couldn't even confide. The sisters couldn't even. They couldn't even do the sister stuff. Vincent van Gogh's parents had a son, a little baby, and they named him Vincent, and he died. And about a year later, they had another son, and they named him Vincent. How would you like to grow up thinking that you're just a replacement for your dead brother? No wonder he was a little bit cuckoo. But, sometimes there are cruel things that take place when the parents are thinking more of themselves than the children. Rachel sees what's going on. She doesn't have any children, and Leah has 4. And she's jealous, and she goes to Jacob, and what does she say? Give me children, or I'm going to die. Maybe she got that from her aunt. I don't know. If you don't give me children, I'm going to die. And Jacob said, am I God? Am I the one who gives children? And she said, well, here, take my maid and have children. Since I can't have children, maybe I can have children through her. And so she had a son, and they named him Dan, which has to do with vindication. Finally, I've been vindicated. I've been judged. And Bilhah had another son and named him Naphtali. And what does that have to do with? I've been struggling so much with my sister, and finally I have prevailed. Wouldn't you like to name your child, I've been struggling with my sister, and finally I've prevailed? Well, Leah had stopped bearing, and so she gave her maid to Jacob. And they had a son, and Leah said, how fortunate, and named him Gad. And then she had another son, and so Leah said, I'm happy. they're going to call me Happy, and so gave him a name that had to do with happiness. Yeah, Asher's a good name. It has to do with happy. In the wheat harvest, Reuben goes out and finds some mandrakes in the field and takes them into his mother Leah. And Rachel says to Leah, "Give me some of your son's mandrakes." There's no way of being sure, but often mandrakes were associated with fertility. And so there may be some magic or desired magic going on here. Maybe with these mandrakes I'll be able to conceive. They will give me fertility. But Leah is not about to give them away for free. And so what deal do they strike up? Yeah, you can have the mandrakes, and I get to have Isaac tonight, and Jacob, I mean. And so Jacob came in, and Leah said, "You're with me tonight. I hired you with my son's mandrakes." How would you feel about that? But you see the manipulation that's going on here? Who is determining his destiny and the destiny of his family? These wives, these two sisters, Rachel and Leah, and they're battling back and forth, and they're controlling everything. He's at their mercy. I mean, he's totally at their mercy. And so he goes with Leah, and she has a fifth son. And this son has to do with wages. I bought this son, and so I'm going to name him something that has to do with wages, Issachar. And then she conceived again and had a sixth son. And God has given me a gift. Now my husband will dwell with me. Now he'll stick with me, and gave him a name that has to do with that.
All right, do we know, did they have two separate households?
I don't. They usually would have separate tents. Yeah. It talks about Sarah's tent and so forth, and so they would have separate. I don't think they were under one roof.
That's good, but,
Yeah, it would be you'd want to have a video of it if it was. It would go viral.
Liviano brought this up when we were studying this in Italy, and he said, so he comes trudging home after working all day, and he goes into Rachel. She goes, no, you're over at Leah's house. Oh, okay. He turns around.
Yeah.
And I have, every time I read this, I just laugh at Liviano, because he did the trudging.
Yeah.
When he was doing it.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the picture.
But they're like thinking of the women because they're in competition for the attention and affection of this husband. The competition started, one of them started the competition, the other one got sucked into it, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, and it goes back to he loved one more than he loved the other.
You can't tell me that Rebecca was more happy with this situation than she was with Esau's wives. There's a lot of drama here, too.
Yeah, you kind of wonder. And then she has a daughter named Dinah. So how many children does Jacob have in all? He has 13. Total. In the end, he's going to have 12 sons and a daughter. But right now he doesn't have all those. But eventually he's going to have a total of 13. And Leah is the one who is the mother of 7 of those, 6 boys and 1 daughter. And then in verse 22, God remembers Rachel. And God gave her the ability to conceive. And so, as we said before, who's really in control of this whole process, regardless of what the humans are doing to mess things up? Who's really in charge of all this? God. And he's the one that determines these things. And this is a sorry name for a child. She named him Joseph, which means, I hope God gives me another son. How would you like to be named? I hope God gives me another son. Okay. What's that? Especially if you're a girl. If you're Dinah and your aunt says, I hope he gives me another son.
Josephine means, I hope God gives me a
What's that?
Josephine might be, I hope God gets.
Add to me, give me more. And it says this because may God add to me another son.
And maybe all this is necessary if you're going to have many descendants as the dust of the
That's right. It's been kind of a slow start. You know, Abraham was going to have a lot of descendants. The only problem was he had 0. Now, Isaac and Rebekah multiplied things because they had 2. And so we need to start adding, or we're not going to get very far very fast. And so now we have 12 sons and a daughter. Well, not yet. We'll have 11 sons and a daughter up to here. And now, from the beginning, what has been Jacob's plan? What was his instruction? What's his plan? Go back home. He was never intended to stay here. He spent 14 years here working for these wives. And it was not his plan and not God's plan for him to stay here. And God had told him that. And so he goes to Laban and he says, hey, send me back home. You know, I've earned it, and so please send me back home. And Laban says, I would rather you don't leave. I love you so much. It's so nice to have my kin around, my relative, my nephew, the son of my beloved daughter. I can't stand to be without you. You brought me a bunch of profit. I'm doing pretty well. The Lord has blessed me because of you. And here the blessing I don't think is a spiritual blessing. I think the blessing here is a physical blessing, and Laban has said, you know what? Financially, it's better if you hang around. I just make a whole lot more when you're around. And he says, just name your wages, and I'll give it to you. This time he's not going to get off so easily by giving him 2 of his daughters. And what is Jacob's response?
Eventually he runs away.
What's that?
Eventually he runs away.
Yeah, eventually he runs away anyway. But what the initial deal he makes is, I'll work, but I need some flocks. I need some herds here of my own. You know, I've taken care of your things, and they've fared very well. Your cattle have done very well. And in verse 30, how much did Laban have before Jacob arrived? You didn't have much when I got here. And now you have a multitude. God has blessed you wherever I've turned. Now how am I going to take care of my own family? And so Laban says, what will I give you? And Jacob said, you don't need to give me anything. If you do this one thing, I'll keep on taking care of your animals. Just let me pass through and take the odd-colored animals, you know, the ones that are not pure colored, and the black ones, and the spotted and the speckled among the goats. And this will be my wages. And that way you can check later on and see if I'm cheating you. Because if you find any of the pure ones, the white ones in my flock, then you'll know that I stole them from you. And Laban said, it was a no-brainer. I'll give you all the rejects. I give you the culls, and I keep the best, and you keep working for me, and my herd keeps increasing, and you get the rejects, and sounds like a good deal. He really didn't expect to have that many of those sheep anyway. He figured most of them would be the regular ones. And so they made that deal. And so they moved the striped and the spotted and the black ones among the sheep and took them 3 days distance so there couldn't be any mixture. But whenever it was the mating time, what did Jacob do? He would take some poplar and almond limbs and peel white stripes on them and set them in front of the flocks in the gutters. And that.
Were they his or were they Laban's?
Yes. they were Laban's, but I think there was there may have been a mixture here, because whenever they mated by the rods, they had the striped, speckled, and spotted. But in verse 40, there seemed to be some mixture with the flock of Laban. Or verse 41. But if the flock was strong, he would put these up, and they would mate, and then the other was feeble, he didn't put them in. And so the feebler became Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. And so, what was the end result for Jacob? His were stronger. He became exceedingly prosperous, had large flocks, and female and male servants, and camels, and donkeys. Twice we've seen a reliance on hocus pocus, on magic. You know, Rachel thought if she could just get some of those mandrakes, then she could become fertile and start having children. And there's a lot of discussion about what Jacob was doing here, but basically Jacob was doing absolutely nothing. Because what did the outcome depend on? God. God was determining the outcome. God was determining which flocks were going to be Jacob's and which were going to be Laban's. And Jacob could have made up anything he wanted to. Go stand on your head in the corner, and you get the better flocks. Because what he chose to do didn't have any impact on the outcome. The outcome was determined solely by God's intervention. And what happened with Rachel, as far as having children, had nothing to do with mandrakes. It was God. And so, in spite of all the manipulating and all of the control, and everybody was doing all these different things, the end result was whatever God wanted to have happen, happened. And God is in total control of all of that. And so as we think about especially Jacob and Esau, first of all, we see the danger of favoritism and the outcome of the favoritism of Isaac and Rebekah, and the favoritism of Jacob toward his wives, and the bad outcome of that. We see Jacob transitioning from a lying, conniving person to someone who learns to rely on God. God is the one who's going to provide his food. God's the one who's going to provide his clothing. God is the one who's going to be in charge. And along the way, he becomes the manipulated, as others in his family manipulate him. But none of that affected the outcome, because God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is the one who is in control.
What was the purpose of the rods?
He thought it would determine the outcome. He thought it was determining the outcome, that the stronger ones would mate at certain, when the rods were exposed a certain way. And some people suggest that it implies a knowledge of genetics. But I think it was just about as valid as the mandrakes. But I think he was convinced that if he did this, then he could manipulate the outcome of the birth process, and that he could cause the strong ones to be his and the weaker ones to be Laban's, when actually all that was happening was God was giving him the stronger ones and giving Laban the weaker ones. And so there are times when we may realize the importance of God in our lives, but we really don't quite act that way. We may try to take control of it ourselves and think, well, we can do this. And there's another lesson that we're learning throughout this whole thing of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so forth, is God's timetable. God made a promise to Abraham, those three promises to Abraham, and the only one he even had a glimpse of was the blessing one. But the other two he didn't get to experience, and passed it on down to Isaac, and Isaac didn't get to experience that. Look at Isaac's children. His descendants are going to inherit this whole land. The only problem is one of them went way far another way, and this one got sent off another direction. They've gone in two different directions. And so what have they gained by so far on the timetable? Because it's God's timetable and not their timetable. What other lessons can we learn from these stories?
I think you can learn that God works through difficult people too. So even like the arguing between like Leah and Rachel, if there hadn't been favoritism between Leah and Rachel, Joseph would have never been sent to Egypt.
Yeah.
Or, you know, even Rebecca and Isaac arguing over Jacob and Esau, you know, if it hadn't been that way, if there hadn't been dissension, you know, God could have, well, he would have, but it allowed him to elect a certain person in a certain way.
Yeah, I think that's probably two good points there. Number one is what, as you were saying, that God can work with those situations. They've created it, but God can work with it to accomplish what he wanted to, which also indicates that God can work with any of us. In any of our flaws and any of our weaknesses, God is able to use us, even in our weaknesses, and God is able to work with that to accomplish his purpose if we just make ourselves available. And so I think that's an important lesson, that God was able to use all this conniving and everything. God didn't cause it. God wasn't behind it. And God could have accomplished it another way. But at the same time, that's the way it is, so he just used it. And the end result is exactly what God wanted. Here he has 2 wives and the 2 handmaids and 13 children eventually going back home with a whole bunch of stuff. So in the end, it's exactly... What was the deal he made with God? If you will protect me and if you will give me clothes and food. Did he give him clothes and food? He gave him a whole bunch more than clothes and food. And God always gives more than what the deal is. But God has kept his part of the bargain. And so Jacob has to go back home now and say, this is my God. He was the God of Abraham. He was the God of Isaac. Now he's my God, because I've developed this relationship with him. And so it takes sometimes going off in the wilderness by ourselves and being isolated and coming to the realization that we don't have the strength to do what we think we can do, and start at the bottom so we can work our way back up with God's help pulling us up to learn that valuable lesson. It gets even more exciting. Huh? Good, yeah. In Genesis 31:33, there's Jacob's tents and Leah's tent and the tent of the 2 maids and Rachel's tent, and so there's a whole bunch of tents.
Wonder whose tent was nicest.
It's a good question. Leah's was the biggest tent. Rachel's was the nicest tent.
You know, if God was able to use Jacob and others in the Bible through their flaws and their manipulations and their shortcomings, just imagine what God can do with people who are faithfully trying to follow him.
Yeah. Now, if he can do those things in spite of the people, think what he can do with people who he doesn't have to do in spite of them, who are pulling the same direction with him. Think what he can do with those people. So which people do we want to be? That God accomplishes his purpose in spite of us, or God accomplishes his purpose along with us? I think I'll choose door B, because there's no door 3. Thank you very much.